These are the results of a long-term research project that I did for a number of years, which really took me to cities and places in Europe where there is a long-standing tradition and commitment to social and affordable housing, particularly in cities. And just to reiterate, I didn't want to research misery. I wanted to actually research best practices and also learn from some of the exemplary ways through which social housing contributes to neighborhood rebuilding and the creation of inclusive cities. So this research project essentially is about building homes and creating communities. I'm going to look at two countries and their housing policy, try to define a mix of housing policy instruments and the impact of those policy instruments on the resilience of social housing provision in the two capital cities, Vienna and Austria. And I'd like to preface this that the methodology is indeed building on case study analysis of different projects and neighborhood rebuilding in the context of urban regeneration, but it also incorporates a lot of qualitative data from interviews with housing providers in those cities, probably over 30 interviews carried over a significant period of time. The notion of resilience is an interesting one, and it was preempted by something which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, the boom and bust that followed and the global crisis in global financial markets that was triggered by mortgage-backed securities and collapsing financial systems in the US. And then, like a house of cards, it affected a lot of systems around the world. The image here is actually from The Economist at the time, before the start of the housing crisis, and it's really quite explanatory, the houses that saved the world. And so the idea was that there was so much investment in real estate that indeed all we had to do is just wait and see how money grows on houses. And indeed at the time there were a handful of places that really weathered the storm quite well, not because of financial prudence or boring banks, which was very much the story of Canada, but it was because they had this more balanced system of housing provision that integrated markets as well as social and non-market housing. So my conceptual framework, the way I approach this study across 6 countries in Europe, but also their capital cities, is again trying to bring 2 things together. One is traditional tools that we have in our toolbox related to housing policy analysis. But the second one is kind of more exciting for me and more interdisciplinary in nature. It's about resilience of social housing systems. And the concept of resilience really is well established in ecology, but also interestingly enough in a lot of engineering studies, very much related to stress testing and physical patterns of resilience. But it hasn't really been applied to housing systems and their behavior, and also to social housing systems. So I've had a lot of challenges there, theoretically, conceptually, to sort of try to ground the research. Nevertheless, I'll walk you very quickly through that package, which I think is more predictable. So I looked at the mix of housing policy instruments in 3 domains: fiscal, financial, and regulatory. And the regulatory part is really more inclusive. So it's not just about rent setting and rent regulation and allocation and who gets in and what's their income, but it's also about planning instruments such as the equivalent of inclusionary housing and the ability to actually regulate the metrics of performance and the outcomes in mixed income, mixed tenure projects. On the resilience side, I think what has emerged as a kind of a package to really begin to define outcomes and metrics of resilient performance with a set of indicators is a few metrics related to the institutional patterns of resilience, then economic patterns of resilience, and there on the economic side it's obviously about the ability of new housing, about growth, the ability of the system to actually bounce back, retain its functionality without changing fundamentals, but also continue to reproduce itself and grow. Also metrics such as prices, the costs of new development on the social side, and that is very much related to the bread and butter of social housing. It's really the quality, it's the access, it's the choice and affordability. And on the environmental side, I really looked at performance of the built environment and things like environmental sustainability, more explicitly tied to energy efficiency retrofits and the energy performance of those developments. It's very, very important to actually anchor that narrative in the context of the legacy of housing systems in those cities, and I think Marietta did talk about the Dutch legacy, and also we heard about New York and London, but also about inclusive Montreal. These are cities of renters, essentially, and they're ranked as one of the most livable and attractive cities in the world. In fact, Vienna never really leaves the top 3. But what is really interesting is in Vienna, in fact, home ownership, which is the red piece of the pie, is actually 19%. So home ownership is really in a minority league, as opposed to what we have in Canadian cities and also a lot of North American cities, where predominant segment of the market is actually the owner-occupied housing. In Amsterdam, indeed, the owner-occupied housing is about 26%. But what is interesting is a very long and sustained legacy of social housing provision, which actually accounts for half of the housing stock. So in terms of how big these cities are, they're the capital cities, but Amsterdam proper, not the large metropolitan area, is about 800,000 people. And in the city of Vienna, it's twice that size in terms of people. What is also interesting is here we have a history of over 100 years where social housing providers, and this goes to the institutional resilience piece, social housing providers are actually private, non-profit associations, but they never really embraced the model of many European cities after the Second World War to build public housing, social housing that is built by city councils or other sort of public entities. So the Dutch were very entrepreneurial at the time, so they set up this private sector agent that has a social mandate and is held accountable in terms of delivering adequate and affordable housing, but also repackaging a number of services to create inclusive neighborhoods. In Vienna, the story is somewhat similar. It goes back to the days of the Red Vienna, where really they were absolutely stressed with shortage of housing and deplorable conditions, very much like Victorian London that Kath was showing for working class people. And so they made a commitment to set up really this very robust program that is going to deliver housing for all. For a very long time, indeed, that was the municipality. So 24% of the housing is still owned by the municipality. But when we actually talk about the 90s, that was a big transformation that Marietta mentioned, which actually discontinued the supply-side subsidies for the housing providers in Amsterdam, but across the Netherlands. In the 90s, actually, the very entrepreneurial people in Vienna and Austria came up with a new model. It's going to be a private agent of change. So these are the so-called limited profit housing providers. So they're private companies that build, maintain, own, finance social housing, but their profit is really kept at 6%. And then there is a requirement, just like for the non-profit housing providers in the Netherlands, to reinvest profits in the sector, as opposed to taking them out and spending on luxury boats and other sort of amenities that normally a private sector will provide. So in terms of the instruments, if we look at the fiscal sort of category of instruments, it's very, very important. We have highly regulated regimes where indeed there's a lot of accountability, but the big difference is that on the supply side, Vienna and in Austria, the housing providers, and these are again private developers, are actually allowed to receive 30% of their development costs covered by a subsidy. So that is a subsidy upfront that really shelters the institution from the fluctuations in the marketplace and provides a lot more stability. Now, you would see also the outcome of that kind of supply side strategy, and I'm not an economist. I really don't believe that that is a very efficient way to do business in housing, but in this case it actually works in an incredibly entrepreneurial and efficient manner. So indeed, there's been some change, and there's trouble in paradise, as we know. So even in Vienna, with a very sustained and robust system of support, there's been a phase of retrenchment where less investment is made in social housing compared to the earlier years, and a similar story as well is valid for Amsterdam. But there is brick and mortar support, and indeed also complemented by the demand-based support, the vouchers, the travel with the households. So we discussed that this is something that we want to see introduced and implemented in a robust way in the Canadian context. In those places, indeed, that kind of support ensures that the housing cost does not exceed 25 to 30% of the household income, and people really do not have the place that is called their home. They don't have to leave it if they have a better job or a better life opportunity. So that demand-based support is essential to maintain the integrity of the operation, but also to run social housing not as a liability, which is something that Steve did talk about, but also as a solid business centered on asset management. In terms of fiscal support, these private agents are allowed to actually use tax deductions, but of course they have to make a profit first to be able to deduct, which is something that the housing associations use in the Netherlands. They operate very much like a business housing providers. They also compete with the private sector. What is interesting in those systems, and Jim Kemeny called them unitary housing systems, is social housing is actually competing with the private rental market for tenants. So there is a lot of pressure, there is a lot of competition. It's not run as a social safety net, which is very much the story of housing, social housing in Canada and the US, as well as some countries in Southern Europe. It's not really a place that is reserved for the poorest of the poor, but it's actually a place that everyone can call home. So naturally, it has a mix of people from different walks of life and also a mix of people from different income categories. Now, in terms of regulation, the regulation is extremely, extremely important. The fact that these are very entrepreneurial entities also means that they actually know the business very well. They set the tone for innovation and product development, and indeed they work in a way to reduce the costs of development of social housing. But the rents are set on a cost recovery principle. So it's not that you're using the asset to provide rent geared to income housing, but indeed you are charging rents on the basis of full cost recovery, and in the end, if the household needs the income support, it's actually available. So the package of housing policy instruments again works to provide that stability for the long-term operation of these private agents, and indeed also to take out the speculative element in the marketplace. So the cost recovery is very, very important. Rents are regulated as well as construction costs, particularly in Vienna. There is a very competitive bidding process, just like Suzanne was explaining. So indeed, if you're bidding for the right to build social housing in these kinds of mixed income, mixed tenure projects. So you have to be awarded the right to do that on the basis of excellence and sustainability performance. But it also means that at that point, the builders in Vienna will actually get that infusion, the 30% subsidy to cover the development costs. The allocation, and this is how, again, there is this regulatory provision to ensure that low-income households are part of these projects, so they're not segregated. 25% of the newly built housing is actually earmarked for allocation by municipalities, and very often these are households with very predictable profile in terms of their income, but also trajectory of housing careers. So single parent, seniors, also a number of people with various disabilities that otherwise would not be able to pay for housing themselves. Incidentally, in both cities, actually students are also a priority category, and I very often think of our students that actually have to find market housing, even on campus. At the moment, our family housing is, a lot of it is vacant because the prices are higher than the market prices across the road. So indeed, in those places, it's part of the sort of the societal commitment to be an inclusive city, an inclusive society, recognizing the fact that students are the future of these places, so they have the right to be housed at a price that they can afford at the moment. Now, the allowances are also centrally regulated. I think we heard from Sarah, you kind of manage allowances, but you also manage the tenants and the stock and everything else. The fact that, again, there is this infusion of money coming from senior level of government is very, very important to provide the reassurance and the ability to manage risks. So if we look at a very sort of generic typology of partnerships, and indeed here there is no place, in fact, for the nonprofit housing provider. It's just private sector agents, but indeed what it shows is different kind of arrangements: design, build, operate, maintain. We are here actually the most sophisticated model, where the private sector would borrow, they would be accountable for the development, they would actually design, build, they will operate and manage. And also it's about asset management, but it's also delivering a bundle of social services and services of support. The stories that we heard today, it's not just about managing the houses and collecting the rents, but it's also providing that hub for social assistance, advice, and really helping people to actually get ahead in life. So, and indeed in other places where I've worked, we're kind of looking at that end of the spectrum, obviously with less robust ability of the private sector to control the whole process. Interestingly enough, in terms of risk management after the crisis in 2008 and 9, what has happened in Amsterdam, the housing associations actually went through a series of mergers and acquisitions. In a very typical way, just the business model requires you to consolidate operations, losses, If they had some properties that were kind of sprinkled through the stock, they had to sell them, offload them to, again, build more efficiency and bring the cost of operation down. In Vienna, nothing of that happened, so they have about 15 of those organizations for the whole city of Vienna. In Amsterdam, it went down from 13 organizations very, very dramatically to something like 8. In terms of planning instruments, as a planner, I really felt that this was extremely important. It's a way of rebuilding the city and creating inclusive neighborhoods. So obviously these cities are very compact. They have a very, very long history that is obviously a lot more than the 100 years that the associations are operating in. But they strategically focus on urban regeneration sites. So this is the old city of Vienna, which is now a UNESCO heritage site. But these are the sites. A lot of these are brownfield sites, greyfield sites, also sites that railway lands, hospital sites, various opportunities to actually capitalize on value of the land. A lot of that is serviced with infrastructure. There is no need to even mention that these are transit-oriented development. It's multimodal transportation that is servicing these areas. What is really important here is that in both cases, and particularly in the city of Vienna, they rely on these private developers to actually take on the risk and fulfill the city's mandated and planning goal of rebuilding that area as an inclusive, mixed income, mixed tenure, but also a very diverse community with retail and jobs and a number of opportunities. In Amsterdam, a very similar story, but again, kind of reinforced by something unique that also exists in a number of European cities, is the city of Amsterdam owns a lot of the land. And when I hear Teresa really anxious to sell land, I think that perhaps we should hold on to that. Because indeed it has allowed the city of Amsterdam to do the land value capture modeling and really through the land lease to again work in a coherent way to implement broader city objectives. And I think some of that, the land lease, is also something that the city of Vancouver did with the Falls Creek development with the co-ops, and there is another story, an interesting one to tell. But so the idea of really coming back to the city and bringing that land back that has been used for industrial uses for some of the dockland developments that is now in prime location, but really doing that requires a lot more commitment, a lot more business confidence and strategic action that a single private developer is unable to undertake. So they have really capitalized on the fact that they have this strong pull of socially mandated and very, very experienced and quite efficient private organizations that are committed to delivering social housing. So going to economic resilience in the city of Vienna, obviously we have it's not that the crisis really didn't make any difference. It did. It reduced the housing output, the ability of the system to recover. But the yellow part is really those non-profit agents. So they're producing close to 4,000 units every year. Okay. Now, almost a higher share than the profit-making industry. And these are some of the projects in terms of social resilience. The critical metrics that I've used are obviously the quality of the housing, but also the affordability. So this is Kabelwerk, one of these projects that has been reinvented as the mixed income, mixed tenure neighborhood. It has renters and owners, shopping, kindergartens, offices. The rent is about 500 euro per month. The waiting list is managed by every provider but the waiting time is less than 1 year. And indeed, the people that receive housing allowances are 5% of the tenants. So by any measure, that new housing is actually universally affordable. So again, we have home ownership on the top, obviously floor, and rental so within one building envelope, we even have mix of different kinds of ownership. In Amsterdam, the story is a bit different, and part of that is because there is no supply side subsidy. So actually, to finance new social housing, they need to have profits from somewhere. So they have used their efficiency, their ability to develop, and they're building exclusively for the home ownership market in Amsterdam. And so the story is very simple. So they have to sell 2 units at a profit to be able to actually fund one social unit. So what we see here is really a much smaller share, so about 900 units per year, but indeed 2/3 of those units are actually sold to homeowners. So very little is left to be added to the social housing sector. Attractive environments, but again, the exposure to the home ownership market and the risk, and indeed at that point, sales were not necessarily brisk, although the government actually allowed banks to lend about 110% of the value of the unit. You would think, you don't have to be a hard-nosed economist to actually predict that will inflate the house prices. But it didn't really make a huge difference because the Dutch were very pragmatic and they really didn't rush to home ownership. So on the social side, the rent is very similar. It's about 500 euro per month. The wait list is again centrally managed, just something that you're really proudly going to launch in Calgary. A hobbing number of households in Amsterdam are on that waiting list, 100,000, given the 800,000 people living in the city, and the wait time is close to 7 and in some cases 10 years. And 25% of the tenants actually need a housing allowance to be able to pay the 500 euro rent. Environmental resilience, very, very strong performance. Again, in Vienna, the sector is really a hotbed for innovation. That is the largest passive housing estate built in Europe and anywhere in the world. About half of the housing built in Vienna is actually built to passive housing standards. This is on former railway lands, and indeed there is a lot of attention to the quality of the public realm. Also, indeed, social housing very often attracts star architects like Zaha Hadid and Norman Foster, and the locally kind of grown architects like Hundertwasser. But this is someone's actually living room, okay, an extension of the living room. So this is social housing in Vienna, just very close to the Danube. In Amsterdam, again, very, very entrepreneurial business providers crafting unique partnerships and strategic alliances to rebuild neighborhoods. And that is one of the housing estates. I think that Catherine and Marietta talked about this, the result of the public housing programs of the 60s and the 70s. The issue with those places is they have too much social housing, okay? So physically they're perfectly fine. They're actually maintained to perfect standards with energy efficiency audits, but they have over 75% of the housing stock being social housing. And so really people vote with their feet. They really don't want to live in those places. So what the housing associations are doing, they're demolishing perfectly fit social housing and replacing that with home ownership and private rental. So this is the New West, where 75% of the housing stock is social housing. So today, that was 2008, today about 45% of housing stock is social housing. So a very dramatic reduction with the infusion of new projects that are for homeowners. And of course a lot of eco strategies. you know, they do edible landscapes and a lot of programs to actually create that social capital and cohesion. And it doesn't mean that owners and renters are really there all the time together, but it means that they do share a lot of these community assets. The performance of the, and then these are energy audits, the performance of the social housing, yes, I'm done, I know. The performance of social housing is actually a lot better in terms of energy efficiency compared to the private rental and also the owner-occupied sector. And with that, I'll leave it to you. Thank you very much.